Big spenders in Tallahassee, big spenders. And what does that mean for Florida State athletics and Florida State football as a whole? We're discussing that now with Warchant.com managing editor Ira Schoffel. My name is Tom Lang. Hit the like button underneath the video. Ira, you have a piece on Warchant.com right now in which you take a look at the numbers. You deep dive into Florida State's budget as it pertains to fiscal year 2022, I guess. Is that proper? 2022, 2023?
Yeah, it's called fiscal year 2023, but it covers from this basically July 1st of 2022 through June 30th of 2023.
Okay, so for that particular year, Florida State amassed a higher total in terms of budget, higher total in terms of revenue, but Florida State spends, based upon that report, there's a lag effect to these things, like a top blank program in college sports.
Yeah, I mean, it's right on the brink of a top 10 team, top 10 program. We'll see now in the new numbers, as the new numbers come out. Basically, the reason we got these numbers is in early January of every year, every school, every public university in the country is required to report to the NCAA their financials for the previous fiscal year. So again, that wrapped up last summer. It doesn't include this past football season. So none of the money they made or the money they spent this past football season is included. It's the year prior to that, from June to July or July to June. But every school around the country is reporting it. And USA Today does a great job. One thing that they do a great job of is later in the spring or in the summer, they'll aggregate all of the data from all the schools, all 130 schools around the country, and put it into one database. And then you can really kind of get a good feel. So last year when they did it, Florida State was like 15th in the country in terms of expenses and, somewhere in that ballpark for revenue. This year, if you took that number, put it in last year, Florida State spent $172 million this past fiscal year. If you put that into last year, it would have been like number 9. Now, of course, some other schools might be spending more too, but I think it's going to be closer to top 10 than it will be where they were last year when they were at 15. I think that they went up, considerably from last year. And I think so they're getting closer to a top 10 athletics budget, which is, again, impressive when you consider that Florida State is not in the big two power conferences.
And this isn't, Ira, like something like a tax form or anything like that where you have to report, a gain or a loss in a given year and there are implications. Like these things tend to be fluid. But what I did note from your article is that 2 fiscal years ago, in terms of the report, Florida State operated at a surplus of about $10 million. And this year there was a bit of a deficit. But the deficit is small, which means that revenues were up too, because Florida State got better on the football field, I would imagine, right? Because that's the big breadwinner in terms of sports in the Southeast.
Yeah, and most of it, everything we're talking about here is football. I mean, if the basketball budget moves $50,000 one way or the other, or the women's basketball team, or baseball, or any of those, they're pretty incremental in the big picture. We talk about the $170 million budget. A third of that or more is going to be the football program. So, and so from year to year, the athletics, the budget expenditures went up $21 million. So again, from 2022 fiscal year, they spent about $150 million as an athletics department on all sports. This past year went up to $171 million.
Yep.
They brought in $169 million, which was an improvement of about $8 or $9 million from the year before. But like you said, it's not quite as much as what they spent. So there's like a $2 million deficit or shortfall. But it's not like a business where, it's not like a business where, okay, where are we going to find that? They're not looking, Michael Alford's not looking under his couch cushions, trying to find some money to make that number up. They had a surplus the year before. They'll spend money that's going to next year before they get to next year. So, a lot of that's fluid, but to get an idea of what schools are spending and making, they have to cut it off somewhere. So they cut it off on those 365 days.
So you talk about it, how football impacts the overall budget. It's a humongous chunk of the athletics budget. And you reported on increases in certain areas for football specifically. What areas did you see some large or notable increases for how Florida State is investing in making sure that their football program is among the most well-funded in the country?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we already know somewhat in terms of a big picture standpoint what they're doing long term and the capital investments they're doing in the stadium and the standalone football facility. And there's some things along those lines and just big ticket items. Some of that is capital investments. Some of it will show up in these kind of documents. So there's a chunk that we don't get details on. It's called other expenses. Basically, it's kind of a catch-all. The way it works is, and if anybody's filled out a budget document or something like that, you might have all of your top categories, and then you might have a miscellaneous. Well, that's kind of what this is, like a miscellaneous category, and it includes a lot of different things. And that budget went up about $15 million. But again, the way it's explained to me is that includes some of the planning and logistics and construction costs that are going into what they're doing with these two big projects. But in terms of tangible investments that we can really see the line items for, a big one is in support staff. Last year, 2 years ago, Florida State spent just over $3 million in support staff. Now that's analysts and recruiting staff and scouts and just different people around the people that help the football staff, the head coach, assistant coaches do their jobs. That total budget was like $3 million, a little over $3 million a couple of years ago. Now that's over $5 million. And I think that's going to go up next year when we get next year's numbers, because they're continuing to invest. And again, this is for people that want to kind of picture it. If you look at Alabama or you look at Clemson or some of those schools and you saw the sidelines or Michigan, where they've got 100 staff members, it seems like they have more staff members than players. Florida State's kind of trending in that direction. And so you see that reflected in there. Another major one is just in recruiting expenses. Not major, but another increase was just in recruiting expenses. Now that might be helicopter trips for Mike Norvell to go see prospects. It might be, planes. It might be just more bodies on the road traveling. But that number went up from about 800,000, close to 900,000 to 1.25 million. So, in the grand scheme of things, not a huge chunk, but it shows in terms of that line item, it's about a 35% increase, which is substantial.
That is substantial, and you're right. It's only going to go up. It's funny how far, and it's amazing how far Florida State has come from the conversations of having to tighten the belt. With David Coburn's time as athletic director, revenues were down, so expenses needed to be cut. This is an era of massive expansion, Ira, and I would imagine, as you're talking about, the next report for fiscal year 2024, and then I would think the one for 2025. This is trending to be a huge balloon effect for Florida State in terms of support staff and recruiting expenses. I mean, at the forefront of Mike Norvell's negotiations, these are third-party reports, but at the forefront of those negotiations weren't just a salary bump, Ira. It was, infrastructure for recruiting. So we can only imagine that these numbers, at least in the football side of the budget, are going to be going up over the next couple of years in these fiscal reports.
Yeah, they definitely are. And it's kind of like you see the lag from the public comments or the reporting that we've done or other people have done to how long it takes to actually see the numbers. Michael Alford, when he became athletic director that first semester, one of the first things he talked about was sitting down with Mike Norvell and basically saying, what do you need? What do you need to be more successful in football? And, they met a lot of those needs. Well, as you said, they met after last week, after Alabama came in and started flirting with Mike Norvell. Florida State again said, okay, what do you need to make you happy here and to give you every resource you need to be successful? And so you're seeing Florida State make that commitment. Now, when Michael Alford talked about that a year or two ago, we're seeing those numbers show up now. Now we're hearing them talk about it again. It might be another year or two before we see those numbers actually show up.
And then just judging by some of the other things, Ira, obviously Florida State, and there's a lawsuit going both ways between the ACC and Florida State. The Noles trying to get out of the conference. You saw and you noted in your article the bump of a couple $1 million in terms of the conference payout, bowl game payouts. One can only imagine that, other power programs in the country, when you're talking about revenues generated, some of these conference payouts are going to put them in a stratosphere where Florida State is on the level right now. They're doing a really good job of competing. But as we get towards the latter part of this decade, it would be critical to see revenues come from the television side of the operation too.
Yeah, and so in the last fiscal year before this one, they got about $30 million and some change in terms of some change from television, their television rights with the ACC. This year was over $32 million. So that's a positive, and I think that's a result probably a lot of from the ACC network getting stronger and building their portfolio. So that's it's some nice incremental revenue in the grand scheme of things. The problem is, as you said, the schools in the SEC, the Big Ten, even the Big 12 have been making more than that. And in the coming years, that number is going to go just skyrocket for those other schools and those other conferences. So again, like if you look at the last year's USA Today database, and Florida State was 15th in expenses. If the number they have this year at 172 million would have put them ninth last year, just behind Penn State. Well, Penn State's in the Big Ten. Penn State's soon going to be getting an extra, $30 or $40 million more than Florida State. The school behind them would be Florida. They're also going to be getting another $30 or $40 million. So it's real challenging. There are some positive revenue numbers, though, I think, in the report. One big one, and it's always important to focus on, is ticket sales and ticket revenue, because if you ask why decisions get made about head coaches, a lot of times it comes down to, are people not coming to the games anymore? Because so much of the revenue comes in through that stadium on those 6 or 7 Saturdays in the fall. And in 2021, the 2021 season, Florida State's ticket revenue for football was about $15 million. In 2022 football season, it was over $22 million. So that's $7 million more, almost 50% more from going 5-7 to going 10-3. We'll see what the numbers were for last season, but I think almost every game was a sellout. So we have to imagine that's going to see another rise next year, which is huge. And then again, this is kind of how that snowball gets rolling. You spend more, but theoretically you're going to make more too.
So, Ira, I'll give you, the last word here in terms of declaring the health of Florida State's athletic budget, their expenses, the way they operate. And I know it needs to be maybe a little bit in a vacuum from the Power 2 and what revenues are coming in from those other conferences, but the sense you get about how healthy Florida State is in terms of an athletic department that not that long ago needed to tighten its belt at every single corner and had budget cuts and salary cuts. Where do you think they are now?
I look at them as a company that's still in expansion mode. If you were talking about the business world, right? Yep. Mm-hmm. They're not as solvent as you'd probably want to be in terms of like piles of reserves, like maybe some universities might have out there. But they're being very aggressive right now. It'd be like a company in acquisition mode, just trying to buy up all these other companies to kind of keep growing and getting bigger and stronger. That's the mode they're in. As somebody who's fiscally conservative, it makes me a little bit nervous at times, because they're pouring every penny they can into this. We saw it in those negotiations with Mike Norvell and what they're committing to football. They are all in on football. They want to get this program as good as it can be, so that when there is a reckoning, if they can get into a different conference, or maybe if there's a shift in the whole landscape, that they're well positioned. But I can't sit here and say, oh, it's totally healthy, everything's perfectly fine, because I think they're spending money that, it's they're not being cautious with it. They're trying to be aggressive, and we'll see how it turns out for them.
For the full story and more reports on what's going on at Florida State and around the country, if you want to play the comparison game, head over to warchant.com. Ira's piece right now on Florida State and their expanding overall athletics budget. Only going to go up from here. We know that they're spending more on football by the season. For Ira, I am Tom here on Warchant TV. We will give you the latest on recruiting this weekend for Junior Day, as well as any developments when it comes to the transfer portal or Florida State's lawsuit with the ACC. Hit the subscribe button on the channel for that information. Head over to warchant.com. Go ahead.
And that red hot FSU basketball team, the FSU men's and women's basketball team are rolling, and baseball's coming up. So softball's coming up. Plenty of coverage of all the sports of Florida State.
There is, going for 6 in a row on Saturday afternoon at the Tucker Center. Stay tuned to Warchant TV for more on all of that.